the United States continues to hold Venezuelan leader Nicolás Maduro captive after an illegal military operation. Ousted Venezuelan leader Nicolás Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores, pleaded not guilty in their first court appearance today in New York. This comes less than 3 days after their kidnapping in a U.S. military operation over the weekend. The two were arraigned on federal drug and weapons charges. Now, Maduro and his wife are being held in a New York detention center. Maduro and Flores both pled not guilty to all charges. Maduro stating in court that he was kidnapped on Saturday and that he is still the president of Venezuela. President Donald Trump over the weekend says otherwise and threatened to expand military operations beyond Venezuela into Colombia. As the legal case against Maduro moves forward, the future of Venezuela remains uncertain, with questions about who will now run the country. Former Vice President and Maduro loyalist Delcy Rodriguez was sworn in today as Venezuela's acting president. Tonight, top U.S. officials briefed a select group of bipartisan lawmakers on Venezuela in a classified setting. This amidst growing concern from some members of Congress who say the military operation was illegal because it lacked congressional authorization. The House Speaker pushed back, supporting the move. Maduro and Flores are expected back in court on March 17th. This is a complicated story. This is a messy story. And this is one that has prompted outrage on every side of the political spectrum. And it's one that really merits a different level of insight. And so I decided to bring in one of the experts. He is a journalist at Dropsite News. José Luis Granados Ceja is really a respected voice, but more importantly, an impassioned and principled voice on this and many other issues. José, thank you so much for joining me.
No, thank you so much for the invite. It's really important we're talking about this. Glad to be here with the Night School.
Help me understand what's happening here. First of all, I was out of the country, so I had a very interesting vantage point when I heard what happened. It didn't seem real to me. Someone, I sort of woke up and was looking at the news, and it was like Donald Trump kidnapped Maduro, and I was like, no. It sounded like something from like the Onion News or something. I couldn't wrap my mind around how that could be possible. And since then, most of the world, it seems to me, has been on one side of this issue. When I returned to the United States today, I'm hearing a very different conversation. First of all, how are you making sense of what happened? You're in Mexico right now, right?
I am in Mexico, yes. I'm based here in Mexico City, but I've been covering Venezuela for about 20 years now, actually, since back in 2005. So I'm a close observer of Venezuela, and obviously been paying a lot of attention given the escalation that the U.S. had been doing over the last few months. Basically, I mean, it's a long-running campaign. We all know that the United States is not a fan of the leadership of Venezuela since the election of Hugo Chavez in 1998, and then his successor, Nicolás Maduro. But obviously, we had seen this campaign of extrajudicial executions in the Caribbean and the Eastern Pacific. And even since then, it was clear this was a pressure campaign. This was just the latest iteration of U.S. imperialism seeking to oust the Bolivarian Revolution from power in Venezuela. And like you, when I saw the news, I woke up around 5 a.m. on Saturday here, local time, and I was literally rubbing my eyes. I thought I was hallucinating. I mentioned to your producer that I injured my hand in the earthquake here on Friday, and I thought it was the painkillers messing with me. That's how hard it was to believe it.
Yeah.
And sure enough, I started digging, and yes, I actually got word from one of my colleagues who's based in Caracas, who texted they've kidnapped our president. And it was just really, really quite difficult to actually kind of take it all in. And sure enough, that is effectively what happened. And I think that's absolutely the right verb to use. This was not a detention. This was a kidnapping. This was a blatantly illegal act. And, you mentioned here in the intro that the U.S. Congress has now been briefed, and we've heard the Washington policymakers, people from the White House talk about how this was a law enforcement operation. I think it's really important that we push back on that, because this is not a law enforcement operation. The United States does not have jurisdiction in Venezuela. It cannot invade a country, kill dozens of people, massacre, apparently. I mean, the Cuban people reported, the president of Cuba, Díaz-Canel, said that the 32 Cuban security officials who were part of Maduro's team were killed trying to defend Maduro. I mean, that's an extraordinarily high number. So this was definitely a battle to actually secure him, detain him, kidnap him, put him on a ship, and then fly him out to New York to now face these charges. And I think it's important also to highlight what he said himself, Mr. Maduro, saying, I am a prisoner of war. I am the president of Venezuela, and this is not not a legal action. And I think he's absolutely correct too. I think he also, when we look at what people are saying in Venezuela, especially this interim government that is, rising to fill the vacuum left by the kidnapping of Maduro, has said as much. Delcy Rodriguez, she is a close confidant of Maduro, has said, I'm only the acting president. The only actual president is Nicolás Maduro.
So there are a few directions I want to go in with you based on what you said and what the world is saying. When I hear first the Trump argument, there are 2 or 3 really big points that they're making. One is that even if it were illegal to oust a president and kidnap a president, that he's not the president, that he stole the election, that he is a rogue narcotraficante who is pretending to be a politician. And so the normal rules of international law, which would fairly clearly and explicitly say you can't just go around snatching up people's heads of state and trying them in your own nation's domestic court. That's not an ambiguous legal thing, right? But they're saying he's not the president, that he stole the election. Now, I want to start there because as someone who has observed from a distance, but somewhat carefully, the election, it does seem that Machado won the election, not Maduro. It does. There does seem to be a legitimate argument that Maduro didn't win the election fair and square. How do you respond to that, and does that matter?
So I don't think it matters because of the brazenness of what happened, right? There is an international institution that would allow for there to be prosecution when the state isn't able or willing to act. That's the International Criminal Court. But we know what the United States Washington Beltway thinks about the International Criminal Court, where there's literally laws on the books about how they would invade The Hague if there ever was a persecution. No, this is just the United States trying to extraterritorially apply its own laws. I mean, of course, the United States has every right to defend its own laws and its vision and all it wants within its territory, within its waters, but that's not what happened here. In terms of these allegations, this is actually something really common. We've been hearing about how there is no democratic legitimacy from the elected leadership of Venezuela, basically since 1998, from the very first time a candidate, in this case, Hugo Chavez, who was not in favor of Washington's policies in the region, had won. And this had been the case forever. In fact, there have been over 20 electoral processes in Venezuela. And the only time that the opposition didn't cry fraud out of all of those were the 2 times that it won. So for me, it's very difficult to take their allegations at face value. And you mentioned Maria Corina Machado, but she was actually prohibited from running, because there was Venezuela's own institutions made a determination that she had engaged in behavior that made her ineligible to run for office. Specifically, she actually took a seat at a multilateral organization representing, if I'm not mistaken, during this off memory, representing Peru. Yes. Despite the fact she was an elected representative of Venezuela, which is a violation. It's seen as a traitorous act.
I should say to be more accurate, because you're right, that the popular, and we see a wave of authoritarian populism in Venezuela, and around the world, frankly, that she was who the people wanted to be president, and that she's been exiled and ousted and basically become an enemy of the state because she was sort of railroaded out of the political process, and Machado has sort of imposed an illegitimate process that made him president.
Well, I think that her popularity in Venezuela has been deliberately overstated. And I think it's really quite interesting that Trump himself said she wouldn't be capable of running the country. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. People who are familiar with her, she was basically created by U.S. soft power. She created an organization way back in the early 2000s called Sumate, which was meant to try to challenge Hugo Chavez and oust him via recall referendum. You know, she was brought to Washington. There's this famous picture of her smiling ear to ear next to George W. Bush. So her profile is always largely dependent on this external support. And even within the Venezuelan opposition, she was a pretty marginal figure. She had always sought the presidency, only recently actually kind of growing her profile to the degree where she became kind of the consensus candidate amongst the opposition. But even then, you know, for example, there's another pretty major figure named Enrique Capriles, and he can't stand her. That's one of the features of the Venezuelan opposition. They almost hate each other more than they hate the government. And so, you know, this idea that she's kind of like this champion of democracy, this you know, iron lady of Venezuela, is one that I think has been deliberately crafted. The fact that Trump admits that she wouldn't be able to govern, I think, is actually really important. It's an admission to something that, you know, people who've been following Venezuela for a while have been saying. You know, she was not actually the figure that we've been told, and certainly a very controversial person within. Does she have her supporters? Absolutely, right? But she represents a hard line, far right element of the opposition, one that supported insurrectionary strategies. Some of you may be familiar with this term, guarimbas. It's where they paid young people to, you know, take over streets in the capital. In some instances, actually violently kill people. They set somebody ablaze because they thought he was a Chavista. They would hang wire across the roads at times to try to decapitate people. She supported all of these kinds of things. This is not somebody who's likely to generate mass support beyond that hardcore base that she most certainly does have. And so I think it's interesting to see that admission from the U.S. And another one as well, which I, you know, on that same line, I just saw that there was a report saying the DOJ has finally given up on this ludicrous notion about Maduro being the head of the Cartel of the Suns, El Cartel de los Soles. And all along, we've been saying this is not a real organization. The Cartel de los Soles does not actually exist. Are there elements perhaps within the Venezuelan state that are engaged in drug trafficking? Yes, like there are in Colombia, like there are in other places throughout Latin America. But this idea of the Cartel de los Soles as being a major criminal organization, all along we had been saying that it was not a real thing, that Maduro couldn't be the head of the fake organization, and they finally admitted it.
What is Cartel de los Soles then? Are you saying, is it like Antifa here? Is it like a nondescript thing that doesn't exist, or is it just that it's an overblown entity?
It's a term that actually started to emerge even before the election of Hugo Chavez. This is a term from the 90s, and it was actually a result of U.S. intelligence actually trying to infiltrate drug trafficking networks in South America. And that's actually where we first heard this term emerge, where they talked about how there was a so-called cartel of the suns because of the medals that Venezuelan officers wear, which often have like a sun symbol on it. So it's always been a total fabrication, but yet it was what Marco Rubio used to always talk about to kind of justify this. It's what they said basically before today when they finally admitted it wasn't a real thing, that this was part of the reason why they had to go after him. He used to always say he's not a legitimate president. He's the head of a criminal organization that's taken over the state. And then it turns out that even their own kind of allegations are starting to fall apart. Their own supporters, their own key allies, I should say, inside of Venezuela, they even admit they actually would never be able to properly govern the country in the first place.
Here's my, and I don't disagree with what you're saying, but at the same time, I have been loath to even address whether Maduro is a drug dealer or cartel leader, or whether or not he won the election, because to me, to make that point would almost reinforce the idea that if he were a bad guy, that Trump would be, you know, right and within his legal boundaries to go in and kidnap him. And I'm like, let's say he did cheat on the election. Let's say that he didn't win. You know, let's say that he is involved in drugs. And of course, there's the hypocrisy of watching how Trump has handled Honduran drug dealers, and watching Trump as he's stood next to many people who haven't had a democratic election in decades, if ever, when it suits his interests. So we already know that there's dishonesty there. But for me, it's like, look, it's not about that. It's about international law and not having the ability to do that.
And I think also, you know, respecting Venezuelan sovereignty. I mean, ultimately,
which is also international law.
This is where we ended up because this didn't start with the extrajudicial campaign of bombings in the Caribbean. This didn't start when, Maduro allegedly, didn't respect the result of the election in 2024 or in 2013 when he ran after the death of Hugo Chavez. I mean, this has been a long running campaign. We saw a US-backed coup that actually briefly ousted Hugo Chavez back in 2002. There has always been direct, blatant U.S. interference in this country, which really, essentially, at the end of the day, what do Venezuelans want? To decide what they want to do with their own country and their own resources the way they have, other countries have the freedom to. I mean, that's quite what it boils down to. And that has always been denied to them by the United States. I mean, why? Well, because it's a threat to U.S. hegemony in the region, particularly in the early years, right, where Venezuela was seen as kind of, the champion, the flag bearer of the left in here in the region that very much did threaten U.S. interests. And that's why you've seen such a vehement campaign to do away with the Bolivarian Revolution, or at least in this instance, specifically Maduro. It really does seem that also they had a bone to pick in particular with him because he was so defiant of, U.S. efforts to oust him.
How much of this is about oil?
A big part, a big part. I think what we're seeing is the United States pivoting back to Latin America. It's an odious term, but the United States has always viewed Latin America as its so-called backyard, as a place where they can access cheap resources, cheap labor, where they can have governments that are willing to allow the United States to basically, do whatever they want. I'm thinking about, for example, Uribe in Colombia, who allowed the United States to establish bases all over Colombian territory. So this is very much about dominance. And I say that because obviously Latin America, a country like Mexico, for example, where I am, has a very deep, long relationship with the United States. Mexico is the United States' #1 trading partner. It's not Canada, it's not China. And that's okay. Of course, we can have relations as long as we're treated as equals, as long as we respect each other as we should, and in accordance with, how the international system has been established. But that's not what the United States wants, and certainly doesn't want it with Donald Trump in power right now. They want dominance. And I think all of that has to do with a broader geopolitical game that's being played right now. The United States, after the end of the Cold War, sought full spectral dominance. They felt that we are the only remaining superpower. We want to call the shots on this entire globe. And for a while they did. But then we saw the emergence of China as a peer rival. And I think people like Rubio in particular understand that the chessboard has changed, that there really is a rival to them. And so I think a lot of what they're doing is trying to go into a strategic retreat, that's the term I use, to try to rebuild their capacity to be able to dispute global hegemony. We know that Netanyahu was recently in the United States, and there was rumors that part of his visit was to talk to Trump about another armed conflict with Iran. And that
just as an aside, there is an arrest warrant out for Benjamin Netanyahu in the International Criminal Court. Did Trump, by any chance that I missed it, I was on vacation, did he arrest him? Did he snatch him up?
Of course not. No, and not only that, but Netanyahu's plane flew over member states who are signatories to the Rome Statute, which is the one that guides the ICC. So, I mean, there you can see the hypocrisy. And you made a really good point, too, and that what's worth emphasizing here. I mean, Trump pardoned a convicted drug trafficker, Juan Orlando Hernandez, who was not convicted by an Honduran court, by a U.S. court, and yet lets him go, but somehow uses that same argument to say, well, we have to go after Maduro. And he's not the only one. Daniel Noboa in Ecuador has very, very clear ties to organized crime. There have been a lot of shipments of cocaine found in his company's bananas. And so if this is about drug trafficking, why aren't they going after Noboa? Well, because he's an ally, because he's aligned with U.S. interests, with this desire, as I was saying, to dominate the region. It's not just about, having commercial relationships. They really do want to have a situation where they call the shots. And we saw it today. I don't know if you saw this tweet by the State Department where they said it's our hemisphere in big, bold letters. This is the attitude that the policymakers currently in Washington right now have. And part of that is why we saw them do what they did with Maduro, to try to send a message to the region. And they've already threatened Colombia, Cuba, Nicaragua, and they're even threatening Mexico, which I just finished telling you is their #1 trading partner. Obviously, we've seen a lot of pushback from Sheinbaum, which I think is important, President Sheinbaum here in Mexico, but we see that they seem to be unhinged. They are very, very emboldened given the success of this operation, in that they were actually able to go in and actually get him out.
Much of the international community has been outraged. I mean, I think one of the more interesting things I saw, both in Spanish and in English, this weekend, and I think it's important to say that because I'm saying that all of much of Latin America and Europe, as well as some of these first world, or rather European nations and first world nations, they were fairly uniform in saying this is an untenable circumstance and an unacceptable practice. I watched people write paragraphs of what was wrong with Maduro, why he was problematic as a figure, why his exit could be good for the Venezuelan people, and yet still they vehemently opposed the operation. They vehemently opposed the practice. They saw it as a bad precedent. They saw it as illegal. They saw it as a slippery slope. They saw it as dangerous as such. They saw it as a gross contravention of international law. They saw it as a gross contravention and disrespect and ignoring of Venezuelan sovereignty. It seemed like everyone of principle, no matter what their political persuasion was, said this is not okay. Some people were like, we hate Maduro, and we're not okay with this. And I saw, as a Middle East scholar, I saw very similar things in Iraq, and that was the first thought that I had, was like, I speak to Iraqis that are like, yeah, Saddam was awful, and he killed X, Y, and Z in my family, et cetera, et cetera. My life might be better with him, but still not like this. Not like this. And I think that's an important thing to note. If the international tenor is so almost uniform, what are the consequences for the United States? What are the penalties? What kind of accountability? What are we going to see?
There has to be something. I mean, it's one of the things that I've been trying to communicate to people, is that this cannot be allowed to have happened without any kind of consequence. In fact, I've made the case that I think they felt emboldened to do this kind of operation precisely because there wasn't enough of a pushback against their illegal campaign in the Caribbean and the Eastern Pacific, killing over 100 people who were merely alleged to have possibly been on a boat that was smuggling drugs. No proof, no trial. There's not even evidence of this. Some of it has washed ashore. And in fact, the only evidence we've seen of drugs has been marijuana, something that was, recently reclassified by Trump himself. So there has to be a consequence. I've been encouraged. I was looking at a report here about the meeting at the United Nations Security Council, where even some of the U.S. allies said as much, saying this is not okay. I appreciate your anecdote there about Iraq as well. And it's made me think about a similar instance here in Mexico in the early 20th century. We obviously had the Mexican Revolution, and the Mexican Revolution went through various phases. But essentially, the leader of the revolution in the beginning stages, Madero, was ousted by a right-wing coup led by Huerta. And the United States, in response, occupied the port of Veracruz here in Mexico to send a message to Huerta. But even then, the revolutionaries who were fighting against Huerta in an armed struggle in that moment said, we don't accept this, because this isn't an attack on Huerta, who's usurped power here in Mexico City. This is an attack on the nation. And the similar in the case of Venezuela. People who are fervent anti-Maduro people say, no, this is an attack on our country. I was at the Zócalo here in Mexico City looking at, it's the big square here, the heart where the National Palace is, and I was looking upon it, and I tears started forming in my eyes. I can't imagine what it would feel like to see U.S. helicopters flying over the skies here like they were there to bomb the country, to seize the president, even if you disagree with them. And so, I really do think that obviously domestically, there's going to be a lot of pressure from Venezuelans to defend their territory, defend their sovereignty, but also internationally, there has to be a very, very, very strong condemnation. We haven't seen it yet enough to the degree that I think needs to be the message sent to the United States here. I will add one anecdote, which I think is a good sign of things that could happen, that will send an important message. Mexico and the United States have a very long, important military cooperation, especially around interdiction of drugs. In order for them to be able to train, to send U.S. troops here to Mexico, or for Mexican troops to go to the U.S. for training, there has to be special permission, because otherwise that's the only way to, in respect of the Mexican Constitution. And so that meeting that would have allowed for that exchange, that military exchange to happen, was canceled by the Mexican Senate. And I think that's the good important message. There needs to be really, really clear messages saying that with concrete kind of outcomes to say that what happened is unacceptable. I mean, you said at the intro here as well, right? We've seen the trampling of international law with the genocide of the Palestinian people. How much longer are we really going to allow, rogue actors? And I think that's the appropriate term, like Trump, like Rubio, like Stephen Miller, to make a mockery of international law, because that boomerang can also come right back.